Welcome. Today we're going to be watching the Cold War explained in 15 minutes. I mean, the Cold War. It was like a pivotal part of my life or my living time, you know what I mean? So, that's something I'm interested in, and the ramifications of the Cold War between the East and the West sort of expanded around the world as people take sides and all of that is going on. But to get the in-depth vibe that happened, what was going on there, maybe what caused it to take like that, let's go ahead and see what this is all about. Welcome to Mr. Giant Reacts. Let's go ahead and YouTube and simmer and see what's going on with this Cold War vibe here.
This video is brought to you by Captivating History. The Cold War was a conflict of competing ideologies, which consumed global politics throughout the 20th century. While it was ostensibly fought between the Soviet Union and the United States of America, the rest of the world was also forced to pick sides in this clash of superpowers. While weapons of mass destruction were stockpiled on both sides, many small wars were fought worldwide. This international conflict brought mankind to the brink, and its impact is still being felt today.
I'll be honest with you, the Cold War was a trip to a certain point, right? Because both sides of the spectrum would get involved in other countries and create issues between opposing sides. That way they don't really have to go in and fight the wars themselves, They just have the people in there fight themselves, Case in point, South America, where you have Nicaragua, the Sandinistas and the Contras. Opposite sides clashing against each other, you know what I mean? It happened in Bolivia, it happened in Chile, it happened in a lot of those South American countries that had a lot of turmoil, especially in the 80s. That happened there. The thing about the Cold War too, how it affected other countries besides the countries that were the main instigators of the Cold War, is that if you have a revolution and the leader of that of the previous leader is part of one side, then that side is going to take his side, and a lot of those people, like I know our Prime Minister in Grenada, he sought exile, refuge in America, you know what I mean? And was it Somoza back in the early 80s or something like that, or maybe almost the mid 80s? Somoza, you know what I mean? He got bombed in New York, you know what I mean? And that's how he died. So, you had to pick sides. I remember during our revolution, when we had our revolution, one of the first places that they tried to get help from was the U.S. No, we're friends with the guy before him, Gary was his name, E.M. Gary. So they picked their side, and they eyed us for 4 years before, boom, you know what I mean? There's communists, they're building an airport, they're going to land MiGs, and they're going to a staging point to hit America. And the thing about it is, I never heard anything like that while living on the island. Never heard them say they're building an airport to bomb MiGs and stuff like that. And you would think we would to use MiGs as a staging ground, or to use Grenada as a staging ground to fly MiGs up to America. And I have never heard that on the island, and it's an island, man. You sneeze on the northern tip and the southern tip by the afternoon, your parents know you sneeze. I know I sneezed in the tongue, or I talk loud in the tongue. By the time I got home from school, my mom already knew, you know what I mean? So it's like they have these where they have it so that if you don't pick a side, you're not going to get anything. You're going to starve, you know what I mean? Because they have the trade embargoes and, all that stuff that they do to you. So you have to get help from somewhere. Unfortunately, most of the help that my island got from Russia was military help. I mean, I ain't never seen so many guns in my life. So you see, the Cold War affected us there too, so, to a certain point. Let's get going. Keep going.
The Cold War was born from the end of World War II, but the seeds of tension were sown long before that. Western countries had been alarmed by the threat of revolutionary communism ever since the Russian Revolution broke out in 1917. In particular, the United States was ideologically wedded to free enterprise and free government ideals, putting them completely at odds with the non-democratic communist regime. Still, America and her allies kept the peace with the USSR during the latter part of World War II, as Stalin proved to be a valuable ally against Hitler's Germany. However, the peace would not last. As the Second World War drew to a close, the Western powers no longer needed to ally themselves with the communist juggernaut, and relations turned frosty. As the Allies marched toward Berlin in the 11th hour of the conflict, it was obvious that control of post-war Europe was hanging in the balance. Germany itself was soon occupied by the Russians, the Americans, the French, and the British. Control of Berlin became the first flashpoint of the Cold War, as the Americans were reluctant to cooperate with the Russians, who were attempting to catch escaping Germans fleeing west to avoid them. Germany and the USSR had fought a particularly ruthless war, and many Germans were terrified of the treatment they were likely to receive in Soviet hands. While the Western powers were determined to aid the Germans and install an independent government as soon as possible, Stalin immediately turned East Germany into a satellite state and plotted to oust the rest of the Allies. By June of 1948, the Soviets had introduced a blockade in Berlin, cutting off roads, railways, and lines of communication in an attempt to starve the American-held West Berlin into submission.
You see, blockades, trade embargoes and stuff like that, with no regards to the ordinary people that's living there. No regards to it. You know what I mean? I guess the premise is if you do a trade embargo or you do a blockade like such, the people will rise up and stuff. I guess they take the whole old time saying a hungry man is an angry man. He's going to revolt or something like that. They think that would work. But when people are afraid, hungry, and weak, and it's ordinary people, they're not warriors or nothing like that, so they're ordinary people. They're too busy trying to survive. It's got to come to an absolute dire situation for them to revolt. So then you have all these people just suffering, until something happens. It's crazy.
USSR was ultimately forced to lift the blockade in 1949, but Berlin remained split down the middle, and it would stay that way until 1989.
And that's what happened. When them two sides pick a side, they split people down. Like how they did the Germany, they split them down the middle. Families on either side got split down the middle. Down the middle. People have their family on that side and the family on that side, and they can't really see each other and talk to each other because if you go over there, you're a traitor. Oh, you're this, you're that. You know what I mean? It's ordinary people that gets hurt more so when they have this sort of thing going on. Because generally speaking, ordinary folks just want to live and be peaceful and enjoy life. You understand what I'm saying?
Across the rest of Europe, most Western soldiers had gone home after Germany was defeated. But troops from the USSR never left Eastern Europe. Soon they installed pro-communist governments in many neighboring countries. The staggering onslaught of Soviet domination led British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to remark that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. Tensions were high, but while the Soviets had many boots on the ground, the Americans had invented the nuclear bomb during the war, which made an all-out conflict unlikely. Unfortunately, to the horror of the Western powers, the Soviets soon successfully field-tested their own nuclear bomb in 1949. To protect themselves against the now enormous communist bloc, the Western powers formed an alliance by founding NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. A few years later, in 1955, the Eastern Bloc countries would sign the Warsaw Pact, forming a coherent alliance of their own. As communism continued to spread across the globe, the Cold War began with a series of proxy wars fought in many different countries. Asia in particular soon became a major theater of war in the ideological battle between communism and the capitalist West. The defeat of Japan in World War II had led to a major power vacuum in the region, causing chaos in several countries. In China, the country's nationalist army, led by Chiang Kai-shek, was seriously weakened after fighting the Japanese, which gave the communist rebels, led by Mao Zedong, an advantage in civil war. The communists quickly won control of China in 1949, while the remaining nationalists were forced to flee to Taiwan, a territory still disputed to this day. Meanwhile, in nearby Korea, the country was split in half at the end of World War II by Soviet and Western troops. who divided the country along the 38th parallel. Emboldened by communist successes in China, the communist North invaded the South, causing the US and 14 other Western countries to send troops to support Seoul's government. The bloody conflict was complex and would end in a total stalemate by 1953. A stalemate which, as of 2021, has still not ended.
And if you notice, whenever they put boots on the ground, it always ends in a stalemate. It never ends in a complete war, winning of the war. You know what I mean? The only how is if that the local people, which I guess they figured out, build up a strong resistance or a strong army and totally overthrow the government. You know what I mean? I guess also it depends on the size of the country too. You know what I mean? It helps to create that stalemate on either side. You know, the things we do to each other, man. But what is it for? Is it for territory? Is it to stop ideology? Is it because these places have natural resources that one or the other want to control or take over? I guess it could be a myriad of all those things. You know what I mean? But I think it's easier to use the bad ideology is going to take over, because that you could spread around the world and get allies to help you with it. And, you know, rather than land, because I mean, people are here, people are in Russia. If they say we just want to take land, the people want to go, well, how does that help us? You know, what does that do to us? Not spreading an ideology is a really good way of getting people to pick sides. I mean, we're seeing it right here, right now in this country, you know what I mean? The people are split down the middle, 50-50, about the ideologies that are being pushed, you know? Oh, those socialists and those communists, and then, oh, we want free market, and people are just clashing like crazy here. I hear arguments every single day on the job. Not by co-workers, but by just people, you know? There's one guy that comes through the line all the time, and he's like, this Bidenomics. And I'm like, you really don't know how economics work, do you? You know what I mean? It depends on what system you're under. Politicians may control the economy, but I don't think they do here. They're getting paid to pass the laws and stuff, but we keep voting them in all the time. You understand what I'm saying? You see, when you take out the human element, a lot of people are going to like go, oh my God, I can't believe you said that. Ideology, in its extreme sense, dehumanizes people. It dehumanizes the people who believe in the ideology, and it helps dehumanize the people who are against the ideology that those people believe in.
That same year, the ferocious Soviet premier, Joseph Stalin, finally died, leading to a government policy shift in the USSR. The new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, had been quietly critical of Stalin, and he soon became one of the USSR's most energetic and competent leaders, loosening some of Stalin's controls on both the economy and the Soviet people. Under his tenure, the USSR would see a massive wave of technological change in a push to fight the culture war against the highly influential United States. One of Khrushchev's key achievements was pushing ahead in the space race, a technological war between the US and the USSR. The space race was fueled by early advances in rocketry that had taken place in Nazi Germany. After the war, both the Soviets and the Americans seized as much information as possible from German scientists. The Americans promised to forget any war crimes committed by Germans who worked for them, while the Soviets simply kidnapped scientists when they found them. While initially the Soviets used this stolen information to make missiles, when Khrushchev heard that the Americans were working on putting a satellite into space, he immediately created the Soviet space program. The Soviets would launch their first satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957, infuriating the Americans, who didn't launch their satellite, Explorer 1, until 1958. While the Americans created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1960, the Soviets would continue to take the lead in the space race for quite some time, getting the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into space in 1961. The race between the two powers to improve technology would lead to many fiery accidents, as poorly tested equipment was used too early by both sides. Eventually, as Soviet progress slowed down in the late 60s under the new Soviet premier Brezhnev, the Americans pulled ahead, landing on the moon in 1969. The early 60s represented not only the peak of the space race, but the absolute peak of Cold War tensions, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the 50s, the small Caribbean country of Cuba had long been overdue a regime change and was experiencing severe social unrest. Still, the US was concerned that any overthrow of the ruling dictator, Batista, would result in a communist government. When the rebel guerrillas, led by Fidel Castro, took over Havana, America was extremely concerned. In 1961, the US launched the Bay of Pigs invasion to remove Castro, but it soon backfired. The attack failed, and Cuba responded by definitively siding with the USSR and officially declaring itself communist. With Cuba on their side, the USSR moved some of its missiles to the island in 1962. When Americans got wind of this, a bitingly tense standoff ensued. President Kennedy responded with a live TV broadcast, during which he declared that if Cuba fired at the US would fire at the USSR, plunging the world into an all-out nuclear war.
Now, you see, I remember this, and I tell you why I remember this, even though I was a kid. There was a popular calypso song back there by, I believe it was the Mighty Sparrow, and it goes, I said, to sink them ships in the bottom of the ocean, Kennedy is the man for them. That was like one of the most popular songs on the island at the time, you know what I mean? That's the cool thing about music on the island. It also reflects the social commentary that's going on around the world. Listen to some reggae and listen to like calypso and stuff like that, you know what I mean? They have their party vibe and stuff like that too, but a lot of it is social commentary. And that song was like really popular then. I mean, we paid a lot close attention to what was going on there, you know? And I think I was too young to remember, but you know, as I was growing up, I hear more, and for some reason, that song stayed popular for the longest time. So then, you know, you get to learn about what's going on around you and things.
The world held its breath as negotiations between the two powers continued. Eventually, it was agreed that the USSR would remove its weapons if the US did likewise, dismantling key missile sites in nearby Turkey. Today, the Cuban Missile Crisis is still the closest the world has ever gotten to a world-ending nuclear cataclysm. To halt the spread of communism, America would get involved in many more nations.
You know what? One of the things I think that was a catalyst for that ending, they sit down and they say, well, you know what? If we drop a nuclear bomb, there wouldn't be anything for us to rule. So we might as well chill and you know, grab as much as we can while we can. You know what I mean? Use those tactics that I talk about, you know, sending dissidents in there to disrupt, you know, governmental processes and stuff in countries that have the natural resources that we need. You know what I'm saying? No, that's my opinion. Comment down below if you have a different opinion.
Politics, just as it had with Cuba. The U.S. forced regime change in several Latin American nations throughout the 20th century, including Guatemala in 1954 and Grenada in 1983. President Lyndon B. Johnson also invaded the Dominican Republic in 1965.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Communist dictatorship from arising when the country was experiencing political turmoil. President Johnson would gain a reputation as something of a war hawk during the Cold War, and he is famous for his involvement in the bloodiest of all the Cold War conflicts, Vietnam. Vietnam was in much the same situation that Korea had been in, split between an American allied South and a communist North. Still, while America had initially been relatively hands-off about the conflict, by the mid-60s it seemed as though the South would lose. In response to a series of attacks on the American military, President Johnson okayed the bombing of Vietnam in Operation Rolling Thunder, before sending many more American soldiers to the country in the summer of 1965. The Vietnam War would become a humanitarian disaster, and it is still grimly remembered today for the extreme psychological damage it caused to those who fought in the conflict. Throughout the war, the Vietnamese communists used guerrilla tactics, taking advantage of the Vietnamese jungle to ambush the Americans at every opportunity. American soldiers often struggled to find the rebel Viet Cong or differentiate between them and the local allies. As the country celebrated Lunar New Year in 1968, communist forces launched a wave of surprise attacks known as the Tet Offensive. In response, the Americans resorted to using napalm to flatten whole villages in a deadly rain of fire. After the Tet Offensive, a string of dramatic attacks carried out by the North Vietnamese, America's anti-war protests became deafeningly loud. American troops were increasingly removed from the country, hoping that the well-trained South Vietnamese would take over the fight. U.S. President Nixon's government would intensify the bombing of Vietnam in the 1970s. The Communist North and the Viet Cong would ultimately wipe out all resistance on the ground by 1975, bringing the hugely unpopular conflict to a close. During the 70s, Cold War tensions eased slightly as a desire.
Oh, so you see, they left trained people there, which kind of helped with the idea that you don't put boots on the ground so quickly if you could infiltrate the people and the government there, and some people might say poison the minds of people against each other. See, that's why I'm always preaching peace, man. People don't understand, they think I'm naive for preaching peace, but usually when people think that, it's people who haven't experienced having bombs dropped on them, loud planes going overhead. You understand what I mean? Anti-aircraft guns going off. I remember they calling them the elephants. Russian-made anti-aircraft guns going off, like an elephant and stuff like that. They haven't experienced that stuff. They romanticize wars. History romanticizes wars to a certain degree, depending on who is telling the story. If their side win, they're going to romanticize it. Nobody speaks of peace anymore very much. It's always, get them, bomb them, annihilate them, We have been entrenched with this warrior mentality, you know what I mean? That somehow men have gotten weaker. If you ask for peace, or you want peace, you're considered weak. And I'm speaking from my own experience. If you notice, I talk about peace a lot. And I had somebody on here says, well, you're looking for utopia. There's no such thing as, I'm going to say this over and over again, there's no such thing as utopia. There's going to be tornadoes, there's going to be hurricanes. Mother Nature going to kick our butt with all the natural stuff that we have no control over. So there's no utopia. People going to die. Natural causes, diseases, whatever. So there's no utopia. But while you're alive, we could have some peace. You understand what I'm saying, thing?
Desire for peace and security on both sides led to a series of talks known as SALT, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. These diplomatic discussions aimed to get both the US and USSR to reduce the number of missiles they had on hand. President Nixon also opened up diplomatic relations with China in 1972. Despite being communist, the Chinese government did not see eye to eye with the Soviet Union, and they were happy to forge a new business relationship with America. While it seemed as though the conflict was cooling down, in 1979, the Soviet Union took the dramatic step of invading Afghanistan to support the communist coup that had broken out there. The new disarmament deal, known as SALT II, soon collapsed, and the US responded by funding and supplying various rebel groups in the region, including extremist Islamic militias. By 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan had pushed Cold War politics to a fevered pitch once more. Reagan used fiery, bellicose language to describe the Soviet Union, and he ramped up the rhetoric about America's war against the evil empire. Reagan's return to Cold War paranoia was deeply polarizing, but he ultimately lived to see the USSR dismantled, which made him extremely popular with many people. Fortunately for Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet premier in 1985. Gorbachev was from a younger generation, fed up with the lack of material progress the Soviet Union was making. The Soviets spent almost 30% of their budget on their military and bread lines. A lack of technological progress over the previous 2 decades meant that the USSR's living standards were dramatically worse than in the West.
No, let me ask a question here. You see what happened with the history of Russia there? Worrying about the military, and The people are suffering, working paycheck to paycheck, trying to get ahead, while spewing rhetoric that creates division among all the people. It sounds familiar, people? Are we not learning from this? It's just the same thing over and over again. It gets to the point where it's a breaking point and everybody's angry and kaboom, everything is explodes. But it's gotten to the point where everybody's so, and I hate to use the term indoctrinated, but for lack of a better term, so indoctrinated in what they believe, be it liberal or be it liberal or be it conservative. There's a difference between politics and humanity. People wanting equal rights and stuff, that's not politics. That's humanity. People wanting good health care, that shouldn't be politics. That's humanity. People wanting well-paying jobs and stuff to live, great living conditions, not having to live in subpar conditions according to what the system says they should have. Crazy, huh? So it just keeps repeating and repeating, and then an explosion, and then there's violence or something drastic happen. It doesn't have to be violence neither, you know what I mean? It just get to the point where people get fed up. But unfortunately, in some cases, by the time they get fed up, they have been so poisoned about the other people that they live with that they're fighting among themselves. Sounds familiar?
By way of a solution, in the late 80s, Gorbachev introduced a series of reforms known as glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He hoped to democratize the USSR, allowing more free movement, free information, and access to more economic markets in a bid to improve living conditions for the Soviet people. Small private business enterprises were suddenly permitted to reintroduce market competition, and the press was finally allowed to print criticism of the administration. As free elections were slowly introduced across many levels of government, it became apparent that Gorbachev had created his own undoing. While Gorbachev sought to reform the USSR, he did not realize that he would ultimately destroy it. When people across the USSR were given more information and the right to choose, they immediately chose to move away from communism. Countries that had been absorbed by the USSR long ago, such as Latvia and Lithuania, quickly formed independence movements. When free movement was announced between East and West Berlin, a crowd of locals smashed the Berlin Wall to pieces, reuniting with their loved ones after decades of division. The USSR's Eastern Bloc allies, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, Albania, and Bulgaria, all threw out their communist governments during a spectacular wave of popular revolts in 1988 to 1991. Gorbachev's uneasy compromise between a communist system and a free market economy began causing chaos, as many people wanted to embrace Western-style capitalism as soon as possible. Gorbachev was soon ousted when Boris Yeltsin was elected Russian president in 1991. Yeltsin banned the Communist Party, demanding more reforms and allowed more countries to break away from Russia. During 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, and many democratic nations emerged from the rubble. The Cold War was finally over. To learn more about the Cold War, check out our book.
Yeah, that was interesting. A lot of the information there I knew about already, except the forming of it, the beginning of it, that, didn't quite understand that it started right there. You understand what I'm saying? I hope you guys enjoyed learning something about this here with me, or refreshing your minds. You know what I mean? I hope the younger generation is paying attention. You know what I mean? History is not something to say, I'm a victim, I should have this, or anything like that. History should be like, let's not make the same mistake again. Let's do the human thing. I'll repeat that. Let's do the human thing and start looking out for each other. I'll leave a link in the description to this video and thing. Y'all could go, check it out without me babbling and thing, even though I like babbling. It's all good, you know what I mean? And please drop a like on the video and comment down below. You understand what I say? Tell me your stories about the Cold War that you remember. And if you wasn't around then or old enough to remember, tell me stories of your parents or grandparents telling you about the Cold War. Let's have a dialogue here. Not an argument, not a like, oh, they did this to me and oh, they did that to me. I totally get that. But we're here now. We're here right now. Let's talk about how we could lessen the ramifications of what the Cold War is. Is the Cold War over? Is the question. Is it over? We still have the same two countries vying over power and thing like that, you know what I mean? Even though China is up there with the rest of them now. Is it over? Let's go ahead and YouTube and simmer. Oh, look at me. Oh man, I got this. We already simmered, you know what I mean? I'm so flustered by talking about this here and thing, you know what I mean? But anyway, man, y'all take care of each other, alright? Cool runnings.